They were the worst playoff team that season. They had a losing record. They had to go through Kareem, Magic Johnson, George Gervin, and Larry Bird to win the title. Nobody was taking them seriously. But in the end, they had people believing they could win it all. Contrary to popular belief, the Houston Rockets were much more than the greatness of Moses Malone. He would need his teammates if he wanted to lead his troops to the promised land. And they all came together to give the NBA its greatest Cinderella story. We first must consider the state of the Rockets during this time. After Malone's first season with the team, they couldn't escape mediocrity. Injuries took them from having the second best record in the Eastern Conference in 1977 to having the third worst record in the league in 1978. But this team saw encouraging signs in 1979. Their young star was voted as the league's most valuable player. He was only 23 years old, and his best was yet to come. All they had to do was build a contending team around the MVP. They tried to find the proper combination around him, but nothing seemed to work. They finished with a 41-41 record in the 1979-80 season, and they were heading in that very same direction in 1981. There were doubts that they would even make the playoffs. During the regular season, the facts say that this wasn't a strong team. They had a record of 11-22 against teams with a winning record and 15-26 on the road. They also lost a total of 13 games by one possession. They didn't have the one go-to scorer in the clutch. The other problem was that they didn't have a true power forward. Having a banged-up Rudy Tomjanovich and Billy Pultz split the role didn't seem to be working well. That put a lot of pressure on Moses to control the paint against teams that were throwing 2 to 3 guys on him to neutralize his impact on the boards. Not that this stopped him from having his way in the vast majority of the time, but still, he needed some help down there. With 11 games left in the regular season, they lost 5 straight and all hope seemed gone. But during the game against the Golden State Warriors, everything changed. That is when their leader, Moses Malone, took matters into his own hands. He knew he would have to play out of his mind if he wanted to make one final push to the playoffs. The final playoff spot was going to come between the Rockets and the Warriors, and Moses responded by having the game of his life. He finished with 51 points on 71% shooting and 19 rebounds. This seemed to spark life in this ball club, especially when we consider what happened next. In the next game against the Blazers, Malone was shut down on offense. He had 14 points on 33% shooting. That is when his teammates proved that they could respond to the challenge. The trio of Robert Reid, Calvin Murphy, and Mike Dunleavy scored a combined 75 points. They pushed Houston to 126-104 victory. This helped set the stage for what they were going to accomplish in the playoffs. They seemed to have a different player step up whenever their backs were against a wall, and they rode that momentum for the rest of the way, and they were able to clinch the final playoff spot. They ended the year going 40-42. It was a cute story, the way they rallied together in the end. But no one was taking them seriously as the playoffs started. Their first round opponent was defending champions, Los Angeles Lakers. They won 14 more games, and they had a loaded roster. They were led by Kareem and Magic Johnson, along with Hall of Famer Jamal Wilkes and the supremely underrated Norm Nixon. This was expected to be another easy Western Conference opponent for them to feast on. But even with all that talent, they didn't have anyone who could stop Moses Malone. For the series, he averaged 31.3 points on 51% shooting, 17.7 rebounds, 3 assists, and 1.7 blocks per game. He was undoubtedly the best player of that series. His style of play was something that Kareem wasn't a huge fan of. He's unrelenting, he's always active on the boards, and he plays an intense style consisting of subtle blows to the body. As the series went on, the captain got more and more frustrated. But to his credit, he contained Moses to 38% shooting in the series clinching game. The rest of the Rockets also struggled to make shots. So how were they able to come out with that upset victory? They forced Magic Johnson to have one of the worst games of his basketball career. He had 10 points on 2 of 14 shooting. The player that had the assignment of guarding him was Reid. At 6'8", he had the size to match up with him and to force him to tough looks. Magic even said once through his Twitter page that Robert was a fierce competitor and one of the best defensive players the league has ever seen. He was certainly speaking from experience. He got so rattled that he airballed the game-winning shot. The Rockets were able to pull off the shocking upset thanks to their defense. After eliminating the defending champions on their home floor, they had all the confidence in the world that they could beat anyone. But there were still doubts. Their next playoff opponent was the San Antonio Spurs, led by George Gervin. This was a team that posted 112.3 points per game during the regular season, the third best in the league. The Rockets were in the middle of the pack when it came to scoring. The question was if they had enough firepower on offense to keep up with the Spurs for a full 7-game series. First, they needed Moses to match George's scoring production. He exceeded expectations as he averaged 28.2 points on 51% shooting compared to the 27.1 points that the Iceman averaged. There were times when he was downright dominant. Take Game 3 for instance, when he recorded 41 points on nearly 70% shooting along with 15 rebounds. But there were a couple of times when he was outshined by one of his teammates. That was a Hall of Famer, Calvin Murphy. This particular series is proof that he didn't carry the Rockets all by himself. He had a lot of help from the pocket rocket. What's even more impressive is that he came through in the two biggest games of the series. We first have Game 5, with the series tied at 2 apiece. While coming off the bench, he exploded for 36 points on nearly 70% shooting. Then he did it all over again in Game 7. The Spurs followed their game plan to perfection as it contained Moses to 31% shooting. He didn't help much on the scoring end. That is when Calvin Murphy came through for one of the most memorable performances in franchise history. He scored 42 points on 68% shooting. Those two games are the perfect example of what made him so great. He is arguably the greatest player under 5'9" in league history. His speed, athleticism, jump shooting ability, and ball handling skills made up for his lack of size. To have an idea of how great of a shooter he was, he led the league in free throw percentage that year with a 95.8% average. The Rockets had such a valuable weapon, and the smallest guy on the floor proved to have the biggest heart. After facing two tough opponents, they caught a break in the conference finals. There was another team out west that was trying out for the Cinderella role. The Kansas City Kings also finished with a 40-42 record. During the semifinals, they beat the best Western Conference team, the Phoenix Suns, in a tough 7-game series. But you could say that they matched up better with the Suns. They were going to have a lot of trouble trying to stop the front court of Houston. And I'm not just talking about Moses. This team was able to fix some of the problems they had at the 4 spot. They made Billy Pulse their full-time starter, and he paired very well with Malone. He worked extremely hard, and his ability to hit mid-range shots gave Moses space to operate on the post. His contributions were felt in Game 3 when he had 20 points on 77% shooting, 12 rebounds, and 2 blocks. In the following game, Moses put the final nail in the coffin. He went for 42 points and 23 rebounds. They took a 3-1 series lead behind his dominant performance, and they took care of business in Game 5. As the final buzzer sounded, they officially pulled off the impossible. This team that was fighting for a playoff spot was now heading to the finals. It was such an incredible accomplishment, but they weren't done yet. The team that they were facing was extremely deep. The Boston Celtics were led by Hall of Famers Larry Bird, Robert Parrish, and Tiny Archibald. On paper, this was the easiest matchup the Celtics could have asked for. This was a battle between the team with the best record in the NBA against the team with the worst record out of the 12 playoff teams. But this was a different Rocket squad, and they were out to prove that they were capable of winning it all. Game 1 was a close battle that came down to the final moments. It was a miscommunication that gave the Celtics an extra opportunity in the final seconds, which Larry Bird capitalized. But in Game 2, they erased all doubts about the legitimacy of this legendary playoff run. They played the Celtics tough for the second game in a row on their home floor. It came down to the final seconds again. This time, Houston saw yet another player that came through in a huge moment. It was Allen Level who hit this tough jumper that pushed the lead to 3 points and ultimately won the game. The Rockets saw something similar happen in Game 4. The Celtics swarmed around Moses and forced him to an inefficient shooting night. He went 11 for 30. That is when the dead-eye shooter, Mike Dunleavy, saved the day with a 28-point performance. But that wasn't the only noteworthy thing that happened. The Rockets took 29 more shots and pulled down 11 more offensive rebounds. They were the aggressors. They proved exactly how they got to this position. They were going to outwork and out-hustle you. After winning Game 4, people were wondering if they could pull off the greatest Cinderella run. But then, Moses Malone opened his mouth. Before Game 5, he said this to reporters about the Celtics. "They ain't that good. I could take 4 guys off the street in Petersburg and beat them." By no surprise, the Celtics used a balanced scoring attack to defeat Houston by 29 points. They did this even with Larry Bird struggling with his shot. It was a poor judgment call by Malone, who gave Boston even more motivation in such a crucial game. To make matters worse, Calvin Murphy hurt his left hand and was out for the rest of the series. They needed to be at full strength if they wanted any chance of beating Boston. Once Larry Bird caught fire, it was over. This Cinderella story did not have a storybook ending, but they did leave an incredible legacy. They are the only team to ever reach the finals with a losing record in the shot clock era. That means they were going to face an extremely difficult road in the playoffs. There was no luck involved with this team. They just needed to click at the right time. And when you have an all-time great player, along with a supporting cast that's willing to fight every second of the game, anything is possible. But what about you all? What do you remember the most from this team? What do you think was the secret to their success? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.